tonight, and for the next couple of sessions, if you will, we're going to cover an kind of a hodgepodge of stuff. We're going to look at privacy rights. All right, we're going to get into some pretty detailed information on privacy rights. We're then going to look at probably next class period or later class period restrictive covenants, and then intellectual property. We'll spend some time on all three of those topics. But let's talk about privacy. Where we want to go in this particular class session is privacy. And why is it that we have to even cover, why do we cover privacy when we're talking about employment law and labor discrimination? Why do we talk about issues of privacy?
Trade secrets.
Okay, trade secrets may come into play. And certainly we'll cover that in a week or two when we talk about restrictive covenants, okay, Tom? But when you say trade secrets, how do trade secrets come into this whole idea of privacy?
You don't want a rival company figuring out, how like KFC has their 23 flavors recipe or whatever. They don't want their rivals like Popeyes or whatever to figure out what their recipe is and sell the same stuff.
Okay. Certainly employers have an interest in protecting certain aspects. But when we talk about, and we'll talk a lot of detail, we'll get into that detail when we talk about restricted covenants and trade secrets and protecting trade secrets, and that may be later on. But what about the individual privacy? Let's talk about individual privacy rights. Why do we talk about those in terms of an employment class or a labor law class? Jackie?
They're not explicitly there that we have a right to privacy, and that extends to when we're in the work environment more for the public sector than the private sector.
Okay.
But it deals with things like having your email gone through or your medical records known or just different aspects of your private life that a reasonable person wouldn't want out there.
Yeah. And employees, here's the question. And we'll talk about that public sector and private sector, and that's going to be real important. But we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But here's the question: if an employee goes to work for an employer, should that employee give up privacy rights while working? Your thoughts? You do have thoughts. Right? Should they? Let's do it this way. I won't ask that open question. Somebody argue why an employee should give up privacy rights when they're at work for an employer. Somebody take that. Lisa.
I think if you're using a company's computer,
okay,
anything that you put on there or say is available to the company as well.
Right. Lisa takes the position that, look, if you're going to be at work and you're using a company equipment or a company computer, then, hey, you give up that right of privacy because it really belongs to the company, so you don't have the right to take that. Why else? Yeah, Patrick.
Along with that, you'd also, an employee be susceptible to getting viruses on a company computer, anything like that, if they were going through different websites.
Okay, so the employer has the right to expect that its employees won't go to places that might give viruses or where it's more susceptible to viruses. All right. What else? Melissa?
Even if something a little different with an employee driving an employee vehicle, you want to know where that employee vehicle is. They don't really have the right to just be at a club or somewhere that they're not supposed to be.
And that's really that is a great point. And let me address that right now because we're not going to spend a lot of time on it tonight and wasn't even going in there. But how can an employer, you talk about a car, all right, and what Melissa says, in case you didn't hear that, Melissa says, hey, an employer has a right with regard to a vehicle to know where that vehicle is and to make sure it's not going somewhere that it shouldn't be, etc. How can an employer, strike that, can an employer monitor where its vehicles go? Melissa?
Well, you would want to think yes.
Let me back up. Bad question on my part. Not from a legal standpoint. Just as a physical, practical manner, is there a way that an employer can monitor where a vehicle goes?
Well, you have the mileage, you have the odometer, you can check
You have mileage, you have odometers. What else?
GPS.
GPS, all right? And if you read, gosh, where does I read? It may have been on an airplane. These little devices, I guess, that look like a jump drive that fit where? Underneath an automobile, and you can put it there as well. Now, employers will probably use the GPS, but certainly physically you're able to track. So then you may lose some privacy issues there. Other reasons that an employer, so an employer, as Lisa says, hey, it's our equipment. We ought to be able to monitor. Patrick says, Patrick, help me out again.
With viruses.
Viruses. We want to protect our equipment. Not only is it our equipment, we ought to be able to see what's on it, but as Patrick takes that a step further and says, hey, we want to make sure we protect our equipment. In a similar vein, Melissa says, you got vehicles out there. We want to know where they're going just to make sure they're being protected and the overall business is being protected. Any other reasons that, from an employer standpoint, that an employee ought to lose privacy when they go in? Jackie.
Is there some aspect of the employee that might normally be covered under their privacy rights, but having that being covered endangers safety of the public somehow?
Okay.
That is sort of a weighted issue, so it's like if you're trying to protect the majority,
Okay.
even if it means finding out something that's considered private.
Yeah, what Jackie says is, hey, sometimes privacy rights have to give way to the protection of the majority. All right? And give me an example.
I don't know if this is actually a legal example, but what comes to my mind is like some sort of health thing where someone shouldn't be operating a type of machinery.
Okay. Well, let's
I don't know if that's a good example.
well, no, let's take that, and we may run with it later tonight. Let's take somebody who has AIDS. All right? If you have AIDS, the question of whether you should be let's take a doctor. If a doctor has AIDS, should he be in the operating room, operating with scalpels, etc., around other people? All right? That may come into play. Won't give, that may come into play in that particular situation. Anybody else? Any other reasons? Man.
They need to ensure that time is being used efficiently.
Yeah, why not? If I'm the employer and I'm paying you to do a job, by God, I want you to do that job. And so I may monitor you or check on it. All right, so we've got, as Amanda says, maybe to make sure that time is being monitored or used efficiently. Is that what you were talking about? All right. Now, having said that, let's flip it. Give me the reasons why an employer should not be allowed to intrude upon the privacy of its employees. Jackie?
Makes it a whole lot easier to discriminate if they're in the middle of your private information.
Okay. Number one, they should, and that's a good argument. Jackie says it makes it easier to discriminate if they're in the middle of your private information. Now, when you say it makes it easier to discriminate, give me an example. I mean, what do you mean? How?
Well, it's, like if they're reading okay, say you're using a computer at your employer's office and you're sending an email to like your partner and you work for an office who, the owner or whatever isn't okay with gay rights or, has issues with that, they could look at your personal emails and be like, oh, we're gonna fire you.
Okay.
And I mean, obviously that's discrimination.
Okay.
So
And maybe, yeah, they can access email to find out if you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing or that they don't like, and therefore then fire you. Now, that can work a couple of ways. Either later, when we're talking about, for right now, we're talking about gay partners, okay? And we're talking about the idea that, hey, if an employer doesn't want somebody there who's a homosexual, they get into their private email and they say, now I can confirm that you are a homosexual, okay? But from a second standpoint, and on that standpoint, they then discriminate. Now, if there are laws that protect against that, and we'll see later on that there really aren't that many yet, but if there are laws that protect against discrimination on the basis of gender preference, then what you get into is a couple of things. Number one, I can just lie and say, if I'm an employer, not the right thing to do, but I can lie and say, well, I didn't check the email or whatever. But secondly, and I think Jackie's where that can go is, I may not find anything related to homosexuality, but I might find that you're doing something else that I don't like and use that even though I'm discriminating against somebody who's a homosexual. You see what I'm saying? So if I've got private information, I may be able to take advantage of that and use it well beyond just the areas that we talked about for protection of the employer. All right, why else for employees? What other reasons? Anybody? So all of you are in favor of all of your employers taking away all your rights. And I say rights, I don't want to, that's what we're debating. Patrick?
You could argue that it discriminates against, well, the Fifth Amendment, your rights to life, liberty, and property.
Okay, the right to life, liberty, and property. And I think that really, as Patrick says, life, liberty, property, Fifth Amendment. And we'll talk about public sector versus private sector in just a minute. But really, that's an argument. That just because I come to a place to work doesn't mean I give up everything else. Yes, my employer has a right to come expect certain things from me, but that doesn't mean I have the right to give up, or I have to give up everything. Patrick?
Then you argue also the Fourth Amendment's unreasonable search and seizure too.
Unreasonable search and seizure. Very good one. We'll talk about that in terms of drug testing. We're going to talk about drug testing later on. We'll talk about polygraph later on. Those might be examples, which gets us back. So really, the original question here is, why do we even talk about privacy in an employer-employment situation? Let's go back to what employment laws are. There's that conflict. Employment laws are needed because there is a conflict between employers and employees, and we see that in the privacy section. All right, with that in mind, then let's talk a little bit who has to give that privacy. And here's the big key, overall key, and we're going to simplify real quick. Governmental entities have to provide more protection of privacy than do private sector. All right? And what do I mean when I say governmental entities or public entities versus the private sector? What are we talking about? Give me an example of a public sector.
Like if you work for the state.
If you work for the state. All right? Now, do I work for the state, Jackie?
Yes.
Yeah, I do. Because right now, I am an employee of Missouri State University, or at least an independent contractor. I think I'm probably an employee. I am an employee, okay? So for right now, I'm an employee of Missouri State University. Now, up until at 6 o'clock tonight when I closed and locked my office, was I a public sector employee? No, all right? Because I work for John Q. Hammond's Hotels and Resorts, and that's a private sector, all right? Now, keep in mind, and I think most of you are aware of this, just because a company is publicly traded or has shares doesn't mean that it's a public corporation, all right? When we talk public corporations, we're talking governmental entities, public entities, okay? And cities, states, universities, all right? So, had the question come up, and it's a great question. Why should there be a difference, or yeah, there is a difference between governmental entities, private sector, and the extent of privacy? Why should there be a difference, or should there be a difference in the standard for governmental employees and private sector employees? And let's back up to make sure everybody's clear on this. Who has more protection? An employee, a governmental employee, or a private sector employee? Yeah, government employee is almost always going to have more protection, all right, and their privacy rights. And you're going to see an exception to that tonight, but generally they're going to have more. Should there be a difference?
No, I think that the government should protect the employees' rights regardless of whether they work for the government or work for a private sector.
Okay.
Protection is protection regardless of who it's for.
Correct. You're absolutely correct in the sense of there is a protection there. Now, so why is there, Darla, the difference then? And I understand fundamentally you disagree with that difference, but let's face it, there is a difference. Why is there a difference then?
Because the private sector does not guarantee those rights, the government does.
There you go. All right. And so it gets back into that idea of how much control should the government have versus over the private sector. All right. And there's that ongoing debate about control and lack of control or freedom from control and this whole idea. So whether we like it or not, whether it should be different or not, the bottom line is governmental employees usually, not always, usually have more protection than do private sector employees. All right? The Fifth Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, those laws are guarantees of rights guaranteed by the government. I, as a private employer, may not guarantee any right whatsoever. Okay? But the government guarantees those rights. And as a result, most people in the governmental sector or the public sector, employees of the public sector, will generally have more rights than those in the private sector. Okay? Now, with that framework in mind, let's talk about areas of privacy that may come into play. Just give me some. We've talked about monitoring of emails. We've kind of mentioned that. Okay? Watching where a vehicle goes. Where else may privacy come into play? Corey?
Phone calls.
Huh?
Phone calls.
Telephone calls. All right. How does privacy come into play before I ever hire somebody? Say I'm looking for an applicant and I'm gonna decide whether or not to hire somebody. How does privacy come into play then?
Drug screening.
Drug screening. All right. We'll talk about drug tests. Where else?
Work history.
Work history. Lisa?
The internet.
The internet. All right. Basically, we can look at that work history, the internet. What are we trying to do, Lisa, when we take the internet and look at a person before we hire them? What are we doing there?
To see if they're doing anything bad.
Okay, yeah, we're seeing if they're doing anything bad. All right. What's that called? Drew?
Background check?
Yeah, well, yeah, okay. We're looking at background checks, all right? So, when we have background checks, why do we need them? Do employers need background checks? And most people say yes. What is the need for a background check? So for a little bit, let's talk about background checks, why we have them, the need for them, and how to conduct them when they're required, et cetera. But what is the need for background checks?
You brought up the example last week of hiring a child molester at like a daycare.
Okay, all right, absolutely. One of the reasons for a background check, as Tom says, is you don't want to hire a child molester for somebody who's going to be working with children. All right, so you would want to do a background check. By the way, not only do you want to do a background check, Missouri and most states require you to do a background check. Okay, they require you to do a background check. Why else may I want to do a background check? What other reasons as an employer? Say I don't have children around, so why? Huh? Whitney?
Well, so you can kind of find out about like what's going on in their personal life, if they're in like, domestic disputes all the time, or if they owe people a lot of money, that could determine what type of employee they are.
Okay. Yeah. And why might I not want to hire somebody that owes people a lot of money?
Number one, they're gonna give you a bad name if people find out they're working for you. Also, they're more desperate. So like, for example, at my shop, if somebody, is in a lot of debt, and they're pulling customers' cars in and out, I might be worried that they're going to steal from the cars or steal from my company.
Steal from the car, steal from the company. So sure, theft. We had, true story, and it's been, several years ago when I was over at the law firm that we were at. We hired a paralegal, and she evidently had some stuff going on in her. No, she did have some stuff going on in her private life, and she took her paralegal card, and literally, I mean, this gal was desperate, and I think there was some other stuff, drugs, etc., going on. I don't know that for a fact, so I won't mention names. But she took her business card, or with our name, firm name on it, and if she got to a stop sign or a stoplight, it was a stoplight, she would stop, get out of her car, walk back to the car behind her, hand him her business card, and say, I'm out of gas, I've got to get my child to the hospital, and if you could just give me $5, $10 so I can go up here to get gas, here's my card, and I guarantee you, I'll take care of it, you know where I am, my firm will take care of it, etc. And that happened on multiple occasions. And eventually, she didn't pay back, right? And probably never did. And most people, are you going to call for $5 or $10? No, you're not. But we happen to represent a lot of people, and we happen to have somebody, she did it with one of our clients. And they go, oh, by the way, I really feel sorry for so-and-so, and you know, she doesn't have to pay me back. And it's like, hello, what are you talking about? And so from that standpoint, you know, would a background check have shown that? No. But is that one of the reasons that you want to run a background check? Because if you find out about it now, all right, you're going to hire that person? No. I mean, nobody's going to hire it. So you've got theft reasons as well. What other reasons? You know, just not working around kids, depending upon the nature of it. Violence, okay? Whitney talks about domestic abuse, okay? You may not want that situation, all right? Any other reasons for background checks? Jackie?
If the person's been involved in a lot of car accidents and it's like a delivery position,
Okay.
it would be a huge liability.
Sure. You don't want somebody that, you know, that constantly rear ends other people or is constantly in automobile accidents. You don't want them driving a car for you, all right? So those are the needs, if you will. Those are some of the needs that we have of background checks. And as we said, Missouri actually requires them, as do some states, for daycare situations, youth services, school bus. When I was coaching my daughter's basketball team, had to get a couple of those, depending upon where we were coaching or what organization we were with, had to go through background checks, okay? So they certainly are required. Now, how do you do the background checks? How do you get them? Well, one of the ways we talked about, Lisa talked about the internet. So how do you go out and do an internet search, background check on the internet?
On Facebook.
Okay, Facebook, all right. Where else? Jackie, you will know this one.
The Missouri, like CaseNet.
CaseNet, all right. Who knows what CaseNet is? Okay, what is it, Tom?
It's basically a website where you can type in somebody's name and it'll list like the offenses they've had in the state.
Okay. CaseNet, yeah, CaseNet is a court, Missouri. Now, listen, it's Missouri, all right? Not every state has their own CaseNet. But Missouri has a program called CaseNet where if you go in and type your name, you can see where a person, the lawsuits that a person has been in, all right? And they may be criminal charges. They may be civil lawsuits, all right? So we get back to Whitney. They may be situations where you can see who do they owe money to, all right? And you got to be careful about using Facebook. You got to be careful about using CaseNet, but it certainly is a way that some people do background checks. How else can we get background checks, Amanda?
Credit report?
Credit report, all right? Now let's talk about credit reports for just a minute. When you say credit report, most people think about a credit report is in, how do most people, do you think, use a credit report or think of a credit report?
Like Equifax or
Okay, Equifax,
credit report
all right.
agencies.
And those credit reporting agencies. But what do most people associate, do most people associate credit reports with employment?
Not most people.
And why? Not necessarily why.
Usually
Okay. When do most people associate credit reports?
When you need a loan.
All right. Amanda says when you need a loan, most people associate a credit report when you need a loan. Absolutely true. However, having gone through that circle with Amanda, she's absolutely right. Credit reports are one way to get background information, because if you get a credit report or it's called a consumer report, you can get a lot of information about a particular individual or a particular applicant. Now, consumer reports, and if you get into management, you got to be careful about running these without authority, without following all the documentation. But let's talk about those. First of all, in order to be able to get a consumer report, an employee must give consent. Okay? The employee must give consent. Also be aware, so not a maybe, they give consent, they have to give consent. So if you're working for somebody now and they say, hey, run a credit report on this person, and you say, well, show me where they've got a consent, and they say, oh, we don't have one, just go ahead, run it, don't worry about it, don't run it, all right? Have to have consent. Keep in mind also, the employee is entitled to request a copy of that report, okay? So the employee may request that report. Now, there are certain steps that an employer must take if they're going to take an adverse action with regard to a credit report. What do I mean by adverse action? What's an adverse action?
You're not getting hired because of your credit report?
Right. Darla says you're not going to get hired because of your credit report. All right. That would be an adverse action. If I choose not to hire somebody based upon their credit report, that is what we call an adverse action. So, the laws require that before an employer takes any adverse action with regard to a particular employee, they must give that employee a pre-adverse action letter. Okay? So before an employer takes any action with regard to an employee, they must give that employee what is called a pre-adverse action. All right? Now, that disclosure, or that notice, if you will, includes a copy of the consumer report and a copy of the summary of the rights that the employee has. And then basically, the employer must also say, hey, we're getting ready to take adverse action against you, and here's why, and you've got an opportunity to dispute it before we do that. Okay, so they give the employer an opportunity to dispute the accuracy or the completeness of the report before the decision is made. Okay. Now, who oversees? Does anybody know who oversees those consumer reports or credit reports? Okay, Federal Trade Commission. Okay, it's the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, oversees those reports and the monitoring of them. I've used in the past, I don't believe I kept it in your supplemental material that we used, but it can be pretty expensive. I've used in the past a couple of cases that show up to $500,000 that companies had to pay when they were running these reports. Okay, so keep in mind that. All right. So we've got the internet, we've got Facebook, we've got CaseNet, we've got consumer reports. How else can we conduct background checks? References, all right. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes people will put down references and you'll go check them out and they're not references at all, or shouldn't be. Okay, we have on occasions had, somebody say, hey, we so and so listed you, and I go, I don't know why they'd list me. Okay, that person walked out or whatever. So sometimes you can check by their actual references. Generally, people who are giving references are going to give people that they think will vouch for them. But where else? Yeah, good point, Tom. References. All right, Melissa.
The former employers.
Former employers. All right. Find out where somebody has been working, and as a former employer, check with them. Okay. Now, what's wrong sometimes with a former employer? Checking with a former employer. Melissa?
They may sometimes not always be truthful, or they may just kind of, not tell you the truth why they either quit or were fired.
Right.
They don't think it was this big a deal.
Right.
It's the employee that left.
Right. And they may not want to stop that person from getting a job, so they hem-haw around it. Okay? Yeah, Amanda.
Can the former employer be liable for things they say to someone that's going to hire?
Yeah, it's a great question. Amanda says, can a former employer be liable to the employee, correct?
Well, to the new employer, like if
Oh,
they
to the new
give
employer.
reference, they're great, and then they ended up doing something.
Yes, there are very few cases where that exists, but yes, that can happen. So Amanda, in case you didn't catch that, Amanda's question is, can a former employer be liable to a new employer for the reference that they give? And the answer is yes. So generally, you may want to be careful about that. I don't think it happens a lot. There aren't a lot of suits around. But I mean, let's take it to the extreme. If we have somebody that we let go because they're stealing, all right, and Amanda calls us up and says, hey, I hear so-and-so is looking for a job. What do you think about them? Oh, and we respond, oh, they're a great employee. You'll do wonderful if you can get them to be hired for you. If you'll hire them, great, all right? Then if they steal from Amanda, Amanda may be able to come back and sue me for giving a false reference. Be basically negligent reporting, okay? Or just flat out fraud, all right? From that standpoint. Generally, the best thing you can do if you're an employer when somebody calls you up for a background check is what?
Tell the truth.
Pardon?
Tell the truth.
Tell the truth, okay? Okay. But if Amanda calls me up and says, what do you think about this employee? And I don't want to tell the truth, but I don't want to lie, all right? What can I say? What can I do? Amanda?
Maybe you could say they're non-rehirable.
Okay. One of the things you can do is say they're non-rehirable. All right. That's one thing you can do. Most people basically will say dates of employment and that they work there. Some companies, because of this idea of being sued, won't even say non-hirable or non-rehirable. All right. And who can bring a cause of action in addition to the future employer? The employee. Okay, we talked a week or two, whatever it was, about defamation. And Lisa says if you tell the truth, and that's absolutely true. I've been to a couple seminars where the human resource people will say, well, you can't give any information whatsoever. That's not what the law says. Law doesn't stop you from giving any information. The problem is you better make sure you're giving accurate information if you're going to give information. Okay? So you have to give the truth if you're going to give it. But there's no law that says you can't give as much as you want. Okay? So an employer can tell as much as they want or as little as they want, but they need to be careful with it and make sure they tell the truth. Where else can we get information? Any place else? Sometimes the application itself. Don't overlook the application as a way of determining certain background information. Maybe true, maybe not true. Okay? that's a possibility. We get all that, we get a background check, and we see somebody has a criminal record. Should employers be prohibited from choosing whether to hire that person or not if they have a criminal record? Let's rephrase that. That didn't come out very well. Should an employer be free to choose whether or not they hire somebody with a criminal record? Yes? Okay. And when we talk a criminal record, and this isn't yes or no, I mean, this isn't there is a right answer or a wrong answer. We talk a criminal record, we're talking misdemeanors more than just traffic. And there may be reasons for traffic, as we've already talked about. Why is it that employers should be able to use criminal records to not hire somebody?
Just puts their company at risk in general.
Okay. Is that you, Jonathan, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And how, give me an example of where a criminal record may do that, Jonathan.
Well, like how intense is the crime? I mean, if they're in trouble for theft, then that's obviously gonna put a red flag that they might steal from you as well.
Okay.
Like if you work at a bank, you're not gonna wanna hire somebody that's been caught stealing money.
You're exactly right. Okay. If I'm working at a bank, I'm not, or if I'm an employer or a vice president or a president of a bank and I'm hiring somebody, I am not going to want, as Anna says, to hire somebody who has been accused of theft. All right. But you've taken the position, and not just you, Anna, but everybody has taken the position, or a lot of people have taken the position that criminal records, I should be able as an employer to use those to decide whether to hire somebody or not. What if I have somebody whose only criminal record is a DWI and they won't be driving in the company? Should I still be able to exclude them if I want to?
Well, you may not want to exclude them yourself, but your insurance company may exclude them for you.
Well, the insurance company may if they're driving, correct. If they're driving. Or let's say instead of a DWI, possession of marijuana.
Well, they might come to the workplace high or drunk.
Okay.
They may not just do those things while they're driving.
Okay. All right. And most states agree. Okay. And hey, by the way, I agree. All right. And most states agree. New York is a different state, just FYI. New York only allows the criminal record to be used if it's in relation to the job that they're applying for. Okay? But most states allow the employer to do what they want. Most states give the employer that freedom. All right. So any questions about background checks or the need for those or why we might do them or where they go? All right. Let's then talk about another privacy issue for just a moment called drug testing. All right. I think Patrick mentioned the Fourth Amendment earlier. And drug testing is generally for public sector employees frequently a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Okay. Now, what's the Fourth Amendment say, Patrick? Let's go back to you.
The Fourth Amendment, based on, was it life, liberty, and property? Or the unreasonable search?
Unreasonable search. All right. And how can drug testing be an unreasonable search?
I mean, if you'd have probable cause or not to search for someone, whether they're on working grounds or not.
Okay. Do you have that probable cause? If you don't have probable cause and you're just testing with the hopes that you might get lucky and find somebody who has marijuana in their system, all right, then, hey, you may not have probable cause. For public sector employees, all right, we're talking public sector employees. For public sector employees, drug testing is allowed when there is a reasonable suspicion. When there is a reasonable suspicion or there is no particular suspicion, but there are safety concerns. Generally for drug testing, It is allowed in the public sector when the public sector employer has a reasonable suspicion or when there is no suspicion but safety concerns demand it. Contrast that, compare that with the private sector where employees are not protected by the Fourth Amendment. So if I want to go drug test my employees, I can do so. And I can pick and choose. What's the problem for a private sector employee if they pick and choose whenever they want to administer a drug test?
They can discriminate.
They can discriminate, okay? So I got to be real careful about that. And that's why you'll find that even though the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to private sectors, even though private sector employers can drug test whenever they want, what you'll find is most private sector employees have particular policies so they make sure that they don't get sued for discrimination if they do administer drug tests. Okay. But for the most part, private sector employees or employers can do whatever they want. Now, there is a caveat to that, and that's what we call the Drug-Free Workplace Act. All right, this is another law we get into with regard to drugs that may limit private sector's employers' testing. It's called the Drug-Free Workplace Act. And the Drug-Free Workplace Act basically provides that federal contractors and people who receive federal money agree that they will run and operate a drug-free workplace. So that they can get the federal grant or the federal money. All right, let me say it again. Basically, the Drug-Free Workplace Act provides that if somebody's going to receive federal money or federal grants or whatever, they will operate a drug-free workplace as a condition of receiving that money. Okay? Let me give you some of the requirements of the employer under the Drug-Free Workplace Act law. Okay? Under the drug-free. And by the way, anybody in here work for a company that receives a lot of federal funds? Grants? Okay. Where do we see that? Where might we see that? School. Okay. Where else? I mean, pardon? Nonprofits may. Sure. Where else? Anybody who does a lot of construction may end up receiving federal monies as well. All right. But here's basically what the Drug-Free Workplace Act requires of employers. All right. A couple of things they require of employers. First of all, the employers must publish a statement notifying its employees that the manufacture, the distribution, the possession, the use of a controlled substance is not tolerated or is prohibited. All right? So the first requirement of the Drug-Free Workplace Act that we'll talk about in here, or that we'll set up in here, is the notice by the employer. And basically the employer has to notify its employees, hey, you can't distribute, you can't manufacture, you can't use, you can't possess a controlled substance. And by the way, if you do, here's what's going to happen to you. Okay. So that's the first thing required of the employers. The second thing the employers are required to do under the Drug-Free Workplace Act is to establish an awareness program that informs its employees about the dangers of drug use, counseling that may be available, penalties that may be imposed. Okay. So the employer also has to establish an awareness program about the dangers of drug use, counseling, rehabilitation that may be available, and the penalties that may be imposed. The Drug-Free Workplace Act also requires that you give that to each of the employees. Okay? And the policy. The company has to have this policy. They have to pass it out. Okay? If a company is found in violation of the Drug-Free Workplace Act, then they may not receive any monies, or their monies may be suspended until they get back in line. I've always found this, not only does the Drug-Free Workplace Act require employers to do something, it requires the employees to do something. And I've always thought this was a funny part of this act, but basically, an employee must notify its employer of any drug conviction within 5 days. Okay? So under the Drug-Free Workplace Act, an employee must notify its employer of any conviction within 5 days. How often do you think that happens? And why not?
Drug use, it's illegal.
It's drug use, it's illegal, but they've been convicted of it. Okay? Why else might I not?
Because now the company is required to carry out the punishment that they've already set out.
Yeah, now the company's probably required to carry out the punishment, and it may say we'll give you rehabilitation, but it may say we'll terminate you or can terminate you. And if the employee gives the notice, okay, within that 5 days, then the employer must notify the federal agency or the contracting agency within 10 days. All right? So the way this works is I get convicted of drug conviction. I go to my employer and say, hey, I've been convicted. Here it is. I'm doing what I'm supposed to. And the employer then turns around and goes to the agency where they're getting the funds and says, hey, I got this employee who's been convicted, and here's what we're going to do about it. Okay? We're either going to fire them or we're going to provide a rehabilitation program. And like it or not, fair or not, it's easier frequently to what? To fire. Yeah, frequently easier to fire. Okay? So you never really get to that stage a lot because most employees aren't going to tell their employers about it. By the way, drug testing is not required under this law. Okay? Drug-Free Workplace Act, right? Drug testing is not required under that particular law. Now, having said that, and keep in mind, not required under that particular law, keep in mind there are some departments that do require drug testing. Okay? Department of Defense requires drug testing for certain sensitive positions. And the Department of Transportation will sometimes require drug testing. Okay? Why might those two departments or agencies require drug testing or utilize drug testing?
Department of Defense handles a lot of sensitive material.
Absolutely. Yeah. As Tom says, the Department of Defense handles a lot of sensitive material. And so when we get into that sensitive material, what we're dealing with, you know, you don't want somebody who's high on drugs or whatever. Okay? And Department of Transportation?
Drives vehicles around the public.
Yeah.
Typically
Yeah.
around a lot
You
of
don't want
people.
your bus drivers, you know, driving while they're high or on drugs. Okay, just not a good combination. Okay. Any questions with regard to anything that we've covered so far, with regard to the background checks, with regard to this privacy issue from that standpoint? Any questions about the Work-Free Drug Place Act or consumer reports? Jackie.
When you said that after the pre-adverse letter, the potential employee has the right to dispute, okay, are you talking about, you know, if there's something wrong in the credit report, like there's identity theft, or like, what if they just got out of a bad relationship where both people had their names on different, you know, pieces of property that they own, and suddenly they're in a lot of debt because that all got
Because of their
transferred
other
or
person.
something. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, does that count as something they could bring up?
They can bring that up.
Okay.
Now, keep in mind, they can just dispute it. The employer doesn't necessarily have, you know, you don't have a trial as to who is right and who is wrong. So they give the employee the opportunity to correct the problem. As a practical matter, you know, it doesn't happen, you know. And where else do you see that? I mean, if you're applying for credit, okay, you will see you have the right to dispute this. Has anybody ever tried to dispute it? You know, you don't really get very far. Once, I remember once was looking online, and this I thought was interesting. Dell, okay? Anybody ever applied for Dell's credit? Okay? If you want a computer, I thought Dell had a great deal. I thought, hey, I don't want to pay the interest. I'll apply. I got turned down. I got a letter that says, hey, you don't qualify for our program. You know why I didn't qualify? Because at that point, I didn't have, you know, I had a pretty good credit report. And they were afraid that what? What's Dell afraid of? They're offering interest-free for a year or whatever. What are they afraid of with somebody who has good credit? John?
That you were just going to pay it off.
That I'm going to pay it off when, you know, I'm going to take advantage of the credit and then pay it off. Because so many times these credit situations are set up so that they expect somebody to miss a payment, okay? Or they expect you not to pay it off when it comes due, all right? Melissa, you started to make a comment.
When we were talking about sending out that letter, is it only when you do the consumer report? It's not like if you just do a background check?
If I do a background check on, let's ask a good question. Is this adverse reporting letter and reporting notice only with regard to the consumer report? And the answer to that question is yes, okay? If I get on CaseNet or if I get on Facebook, I'm not required under the Fair Trade Commission to give notice to anybody, all right? And I will tell you, you might as well, if you're not familiar with CaseNet, get familiar with it and run your own self before you apply for a job. Because I can tell you, right or wrong, 90% of the employers, that's probably a little high, but I bet 75% of the employers run that, okay? And I won't ask anybody in here who's involved in business if they run it, but I can tell you there are a lot of employers out there that do it. One of the things that we saw at our law firm, which was interesting, is if we hired somebody, it wasn't so much that we were the ones checking on CaseNet, it was all of our employees checking the others. And it was like, oh, you can't hire her because look at this, you know, well, you know. It's like, really? That's not your place one way or the other. But it was interesting because we would get that from time to time saying, run a CaseNet check on her. And my thought was, wait a second, I don't think we asked you to do that. Why don't, you know, you do what you're supposed to do and we'll do what we're supposed to do and we'll all be happy. But no, somebody will run a CaseNet on you, okay? So if you wonder whether or not you have any record out there, then go ahead and run it yourself because your employer will. And be careful what you say on Facebook. You know, I remember representing, I don't think I've told you this in here. Sometimes things overlap, and so I'll tell the same story twice. I tell you about the kid that got suspended from school for beating up another kid. Tell you this? Okay. I was representing, yeah, I better not give those facts. Bottom line, I won't tell you how I got to represent this kid because I didn't do much criminal work or much school work at that particular time. But a kid he was a senior at an area around here, and he had just beat the crap, I don't know how else to say it, beat the crap out of another kid. I mean, just pummeled him, okay? Senior year, and his mom comes to me and says, you got to help us. And so I sat down, I said, look, we got a tough case here, but we sat down and found out that there was going to be a board hearing that he could appeal, so we appealed it to the board because they were going to suspend him and basically cause him to go to school one more year. So we were talking a serious infringement. And I said, all right. So he comes in, and I thought, this kid has no remorse whatsoever. He's not sorry at all. But we talk about the hearing, we prepare for the hearing, we explain, you do have remorse, right? And we tried to get him, I could tell he didn't. So I go to the hearing about 2 weeks later, and I walk in and I meet the other attorney for the school board, and they say, hey, I just want to be fair with you. I don't want to surprise you when we have this hearing. Let me show you something. She took out the Facebook page. It wasn't Facebook. Remember MySpace? Okay, it was a MySpace page. Took out the MySpace page, gives it to me, and I'm reading it, and yeah, board hearing tonight, beat the SHIT out of this kid, and guess what? I'd do it again. And it's like, really? So I show it to, mom says, my son didn't write that. And I said, well, somebody did, and it doesn't look good. And we were able to eventually work out something where, he'd go to school that summer and maybe graduate. But I'm amazed at what I see people put on Facebook, on MySpace, and expect their employers not to look at it. And they will. And if you're out there doing it, look at your Facebook page if you're seriously looking for a job, because it will affect you. And as managers, be careful what you rely on, but it's out there.